Okay, so today we're really getting into something crucial, something that's like the backbone of safety on so many construction projects, especially the ones that get federal money, the funding or any kind of assistance from the government.
Right, it's like essential knowledge if you're in the safety world, especially if you're working on those federally connected projects. We're talking about the core legal rules, the ones that really shape how safety is enforced on these sites.
Exactly. And think of this deep dive as your guide to really getting this. It can be complex, but we'll break it down and you'll walk away with a super clear picture of what projects are covered and why it matters, for everyone on those job sites.
Yeah, it's about understanding the why behind it all, not just the what.
So what are we actually diving into? Well, we're looking at legal text, real deal stuff. Specifically, it's Reorganization Plan number 14 from 1950.
Now, I know that might sound kind of dry, like something out of a history book.
Like, yeah, the dusty old document, right?
Yeah. But trust me, this thing is a game changer. It basically set the stage for how the Secretary of Labor handles enforcing labor standards on all these federally connected construction contracts.
Yeah, it's like way back then, they didn't want to create a whole new set of rules every time the government got involved in a project.
Right, it would have been a huge mess, right?
So instead, they made this plan, this Reorganization Plan number 14, to give the Secretary of Labor the authority to set the standards, the regulations, the procedures, all that, for enforcing labor standards across a whole bunch of different federal initiatives.
And if you're ever looking for those specific rules, the ones that come directly from this plan, they're all published in Part 5 of the relevant title.
Part 5, okay, got it. So this reorganization plan, it didn't just come out of thin air. It was made to work with laws that already existed. I'm talking about key statutes. And the one that probably rings a bell for most people in construction is, well, the Davis-Bacon Act. The one about prevailing wages.
Ah, Davis-Bacon, the one we all know and love, right?
Yeah, but its reach is way bigger than you might think. It actually extends to federal aid highway legislation, which is under 23 USC 113.
And for safety pros, this connection is super important. It's not just random that the same authority, the Secretary of Labor, is involved in both prevailing wage requirements on federal highways and setting safety standards. It shows you how intertwined fair labor standards are with safe working conditions, especially on these federally funded projects. It's like two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, you can't really have one without the other, can you?
Exactly. And another crucial one that falls under this plan is the Contract Work Hour Standards Act. You can find that one in Section 104. Now, that act's all about overtime pay, but we all know managing those work hours effectively is key to preventing fatigue on the job site, which, of course, helps with safety.
Yet no one's working at their best when they're exhausted, and that's when accidents are more likely to happen. So you've got Davis-Bacon and the Contract Work Hours Standards Act right there in the plan. But the thing is, Reorganization Plan No. 14's influence, it doesn't stop there. Other statutes, over time, they also became subject to it, either from the very start or because it got applied to them later on.
Yeah, it's like this ripple effect. This one plan back in 1950, it just keeps on impacting stuff.
It's kind of wild when you think about it.
For sure. If you work in safety, understanding Reorganization Plan No. 14, it's like understanding the control panel for a whole system. It's the source of the authority that enforces labor standards. And we've already talked about how much that ties into safety, right? And it channels that authority through a ton of different laws related to federally funded and assisted construction. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah, it really is. Okay, let's get into some specific examples. Let's start with Federal Aid Highway Acts under 23 USC 113. We're not just talking about brand new highway construction here.
No, it's way broader than that.
It's also about reconstruction and improvement work. Think about it. Whether it's a totally new road getting paved or just some serious upgrades to an existing one, if there's federal funding involved, boom, those regulations we've been talking about, they're probably in play.
And if you're managing safety on these projects, it's not just about the type of work, it's also about who's doing it, because these rules apply to the main contractor, obviously, but also to any subcontractors they bring on.
Oh, so it's everyone down the line.
Exactly. Everyone involved in those federal aid highway systems. That way, the labor standards and all those safety expectations that come with them, they're applied consistently to every single worker on the project.
So we're talking about, what does federal aid highway systems actually mean?
Well, think about the main roads, the primary and secondary routes, those extensions that go through urban areas. all those congested bits, and of course, the entire interstate system.
Yeah, that's a lot of ground.
Right.
Yeah, that's a lot of road. And all of that, if there's federal money involved, those regulations are relevant.
Absolutely. And there's a legal opinion to back this up. You can look it up. It's cited as 41 OP AG 488 496. And it basically confirms that all those federal aid highway acts are subject to Reorganization Plan number 14. It's solid legal ground, you know.
Okay, so that's highways. Now let's talk about housing, because that's another huge area where federal funding and assistance play a big role. And the big player here is the National Housing Act. This act covers a ton of housing initiatives that get federal support through loans and mortgage insurance.
I mean, the National Housing Act is massive. It's seriously important for anyone in safety to understand its scope because it touches pretty much every type of residential construction you can think of.
So this is where we really see the federal government putting its money where its mouth is, right? They're making sure that labor standards, and by extension, safety, are baked into how housing gets developed.
Exactly. And the best way to see that is by looking at all the different sections within the National Housing Act that are subject to Reorganization Plan number 14.
It's a lot, right? So let's try to break it down a little, make it digestible.
Sounds good. Let's go one by one.
Okay, let's start with Section 1713, which covers rental housing. This section basically deals with mortgage insurance for rental properties. And we're talking 8 or more units and even mobile home courts.
Yeah.
So that means like large apartment buildings and even those manufactured housing communities, a lot of them fall under these federal labor and safety standards.
Then you have Section 1715E, which is all about cooperative housing. That includes mortgage insurance for co-ops, 5 or more units, and even loans for, if they need to make improvements or repairs, or even when memberships are being sold or resold. So it's not just about building new stuff, it's about the whole life cycle of these co-ops,
Right, the upkeep, the changes, all of it.
Exactly. And then there's urban renewal housing under Section 1715K. This one's for mortgage insurance on both single-family and multifamily housing. But the catch is they have to be in designated urban renewal areas.
So it's like when the government is trying to revitalize a community.
Yeah, and when they're putting money into that, they're saying, okay, we want to make sure these projects are done right, and that includes labor practices and worker safety.
Makes sense. Okay, what else?
Well, Section 1715 LD 3 and 4 are really important ones because they deal with low or moderate income housing. And this is all about making sure those projects, the ones that aim to provide more affordable housing, they also have to follow the same rules about labor standards and safety.
So no cutting corners just because it's like more affordable housing.
Exactly. And then there's Section 1715V, which covers housing for elderly or handicapped persons. It's mortgage insurance for rental housing that's specifically designed for those groups, to meet their specific needs.
It's good to know that even those more specialized housing projects, they still have those worker protections in place.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about nursing homes, which are under Section 1715W. This is mortgage insurance, not just for the building itself, but also for any major equipment.
So it's not just building the nursing home, it's equipping it too.
Right. It highlights how these regulations apply to healthcare infrastructure, not just, typical construction.
Okay, so that's rental housing, co-ops, urban renewal, affordable housing, housing for the elderly and handicapped, and nursing homes. What else is there?
There's a lot more, actually. Let's move on to Section 1715X, which covers experimental housing. This is for projects that try new things, like new designs or materials, the innovative stuff.
So even when the construction industry is trying to push the envelope, the basic labor standards still apply.
Yep, no matter how experimental the project is. And then there's yield insurance under Section 1747, which ensures the investment returns on multifamily housing projects.
So even the financial side of things is tied to these regulations.
Right. It creates this comprehensive framework. And then we have Section 1748, which deals with armed services housing, and it's about dealing with housing shortages near military bases.
That's super important, especially with how often military families have to move.
Exactly. And this shows how projects that are directly tied to national defense, they also have to stick to these same standards.
Okay, that makes sense.
And building on that, there's defense housing for impacted areas under Section 1748 too. Now, this provides mortgage insurance for housing mainly for military personnel or civilian personnel working for the armed services, NASA, or the Atomic Energy Commission. So it's like all the key players in national security, they're all linked to these regulations.
Like a web, right?
Totally. And to continue with the national security theme, there's defense rental housing under Section 1750, which provides mortgage insurance specifically in areas that are considered critical for defense housing.
So it's about where those houses are located, too.
Yeah, the location matters. And then, we've been talking a lot about new construction, but there's also Section 1715 LH1, which deals with rehabilitation projects. Now, this section provides mortgage insurance for nonprofits that are buying and fixing up older housing so they can resell it to low-income buyers.
So it's not just about building new, it's about making the existing housing stock better, too.
Right. And even those efforts, if they're part of a federal program, they have to follow these standards.
Okay, makes sense. What else is there?
Well, there's homeowner assistance under Section 1715ZJ1. This one authorizes mortgage insurance to nonprofits or public bodies that finance the sale and rehab of individual homes for lower-income families. So even helping individual homeowners get into better homes falls under this umbrella.
It's really about making sure everyone has access to safe and decent housing, regardless of their income level.
Exactly. And then there's Section 1715Z1, which is all about rental housing assistance. It authorizes mortgage insurance and even interest reduction payments for rental projects that are specifically aimed at lower-income families. And that includes families who are already getting help from the state or local governments.
So it's like a layered approach to providing support.
Exactly. It widens the scope of these regulations quite a bit.
Makes sense. Okay, what else?
Okay, so there's condominium housing under Section 1715 YD. This one provides mortgage insurance for developing the actual building sites, including the infrastructure like the water and sewer lines, roads, and drainage systems. It's not just about the buildings themselves, it's about creating the whole community.
And making sure that infrastructure is built safely, too.
Exactly. And let's not forget about group medical practice facilities, which are covered under subchapter LXB. This authorizes mortgage insurance for building and equipping facilities for group medical practices, optometry practices, or even dental practices.
So it's not just hospitals, it's other types of healthcare facilities too.
Right. And lastly, for the National Housing Act, we have nonprofit hospitals under Section 1715Z7. This one's for mortgage insurance on both new and rehabbed hospitals, and it even includes their initial equipment.
So pretty much every aspect of building and equipping a hospital is covered.
Right. And it just shows how widespread these regulations are when it comes to healthcare facilities that are getting federal support. It really is a big deal.
It is. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground already, but there are still other important laws to talk about. For instance, there's the Hospital Survey and Construction Act, as amended. Now, this one covers construction contracts that are done by state or local authorities or even private institutions, but the key is they're all getting federal grant and aid money for building hospitals and other medical facilities. And you can find the details on that under 42 U.S.C. 291E. So it's like, if there's federal money going into healthcare projects, you could bet these safety rules are going to be in effect.
Yeah, and it's about making sure there's a basic level of worker protection on any project where the federal government is shipping in, whether it's a public or private entity doing the actual construction.
It's about, setting a standard.
Exactly.
Okay, so what's next?
Well, let's talk about airports. Specifically, the Federal Airport Act under 49 U.S.C. 1114B. This act gives grants for specific types of airport construction, like we're talking the initial site prep, building runways, taxiways, aprons, the stuff planes need, and then lighting, of course, and even the buildings for fire, rescue, and maintenance crews, all the essential stuff.
But it's not everything at the airport, right?
No, there are some key things that aren't covered. This act specifically says it doesn't cover construction for public parking lots, the ones for cars. And it usually doesn't cover the cost of building airport terminals either.
So where all the passengers go?
Right. But there is one exception. If part of the terminal building is directly related to safety, then it might be covered. So a brand new passenger terminal, that might not be under this section. But if you're building a new fire station on the airfield, that's probably included.
So it's about safety for the airport itself, the operational side of things.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's move on to the Housing Act of 1949 now. It's under 42 U.S.C. 1459. This act covers those construction contracts awarded by local authorities that are being financed through federal loans and grants.
And the programs under this act, they're all over the place, you know. Mostly they focus on getting rid of slums and all those urban renewal projects. We're talking rehab grants, neighborhood development programs, community renewal stuff, demolition, and even help for areas that are considered blighted.
Yeah.
So it's all about the government stepping in to revitalize those urban areas, but they're also making sure those projects are done right with fair labor practices and good safety standards.
That makes sense. It's like a holistic approach. So are there any other important parts of the Housing Act of 1949 we should know about?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Like, there's this connection to the Housing Act of 1964, specifically paragraph B21, which is all about financial assistance for low-rent housing for farm workers. It's interesting how within these big, broad laws, they'll have sections that are really targeted at very specific types of housing.
It shows how much attention they paid to making sure everyone had access to decent housing, regardless of their job or where they lived.
For sure. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about schools. You have the School Survey and Construction Act of 1950, which is under 20 U.S.C. 636. It's a federal grant program to help build schools in areas that have been impacted by, federal stuff.
So like areas with a lot of military bases or other federal facilities.
Exactly, because those areas, they often have unique needs when it comes to education.
And it makes sense that they'd want to make sure those schools are built safely too.
For sure. And then we have the United States Housing Act of 1937, which is under 42 U.S.C. 1416. This one covers the construction of public housing, the low-rent kind, and projects that are all about getting rid of slums. But the key here is these projects are given to local authorities, but the money comes from federal loans and grants.
So the feds are still calling the shots, even though it's local authorities doing the work.
Right. And this is a super important law because it's one of the foundational pieces of legislation when it comes to public housing. And for safety professionals, it's important to remember that these projects, even though they're about providing affordable housing, they still have to follow those labor standards that we've been talking about, the ones that are enforced through Reorganization Plan number 14.
No cutting corners, even for a good cause.
Right. And then we have the Federal Civil Defense Act of 1950, which you can find under 50 USC App 2281. This one's all about giving states and their local areas help with civil defense. And that help, it can include buying, building, leasing, or renovating all the stuff they need, the materials and buildings.
So like emergency shelters and stuff.
Yeah, things like that. So even projects that are all about being prepared for emergencies, they can also be subject to these federal labor standards.
It's pretty amazing how far-reaching these regulations are.
I know, right? And it shows how seriously the government takes labor standards and safety, across such a wide range of project types. It's all about making sure workers are protected no matter what kind of project they're working on.
It's impressive for sure. Okay, so we've talked about highways, housing, schools, and even emergency preparedness. What else is there?
Well, let's look at something a little different now. The Delaware River Basin Compact, specifically Section 15.1 of 75 Stats 714. Now, this one created a regional agency, and their whole job is to manage the water resources in the Delaware River Basin.
Okay, so it's about water, but how does that tie into construction and labor standards?
Well, this agency was formed by a bunch of states and the federal government. So any construction projects that come out of this compact, things related to managing the water resources, they can fall under these federal labor standards because the U.S. government is involved.
So even though it's a regional thing, the feds are still in the mix.
Yeah, and that brings those labor standards into play.
Okay, that's interesting. So what about like research facilities and stuff? Do those fall under these regulations too?
You bet. Let's talk about the Cooperative Research Act, which is under 20 USC 332 AC. This act gives federal grants to universities and nonprofits for building research facilities, the ones specifically for education. And when they say construction, they mean everything, not just new buildings. They mean buying buildings, expanding them, remodeling them, and even equipping them.
So it's the whole shebang.
Yeah, pretty much. So if you're building or outfitting a research facility and it's getting federal funding, these standards apply. And that's good news for the workers because it means they're going to be protected.
Absolutely. And then there's the Health Professions Educational Assistance Act of 1963, which is under 42 U.S.C. 292nd C4 and 293A C5. This one's for grants to help public and nonprofit medical, dental, and similar schools. And those grants are for building, expanding, or renovating their teaching facilities.
So again, the feds are supporting healthcare education by helping them build their infrastructure, but they're also making sure those projects are done right with fair labor practices and safe working conditions. It's a win-win, really.
It is. Okay, so what about research and facilities specifically for individuals with disabilities? Are those covered too?
Absolutely. The Mental Retardation Facilities Construction Act, which is under 42 U.S.C. 295A2D, 22662.5, and 2675A5, authorizes federal help for building research centers, university-affiliated facilities, and other facilities that are specifically for people with mental retardation.
It's great that they're making sure those facilities are built with the same high standards as any other project.
For sure. And then there's the Community Mental Health Centers Act under 42 U.S.C. 5. This one's for federal grants for building community mental health centers, specifically the public and nonprofit ones. So it's all about making sure these important mental health resources are available to everyone.
And that those facilities are built safely too.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about research facilities for education and then for specific areas of healthcare. What about like higher education in general? Are there any laws that cover that?
Oh, yeah. For sure. The Higher Education Facilities Act of 1963, which is at 20 U.S.C. 753, authorizes both grants and loans to help public and nonprofit colleges and universities pay for building, fixing up, or improving their academic buildings and other related facilities.
So like dorms, libraries, classrooms, all that.
Exactly. And then there's the Vocational Educational Act of 1963, which is under 20 U.S.C. 35. This one provides federal grants to states specifically for building area vocational education schools.
So it's not just traditional colleges, it's about providing training for people to get into specific trades and careers.
Right. And even those facilities, when they're built with federal money, they have to follow those labor standards that ensure worker safety.
It's all about making sure everyone is protected no matter what kind of education or training they're getting.
Absolutely. And speaking of important community facilities, the Library Services and Construction Act, 20 U.S.C. 355E, provides federal assistance to states specifically for building public libraries.
Oh, yeah, libraries are so important.
For sure. And when they're built with federal funding, those important labor standards are in play.
Makes sense. Now, we've talked about highways and airports, but what about like public transportation in cities?
Well, there's the Urban Mass Transportation Act of 1964, which is under 49 U.S.C. 1609. It provides grants and loans to help states and local areas pay for buying, building, rebuilding, and improving mass transit systems in cities.
So like subways, buses, light rail, all that.
Yeah, all of that. And it even covers the buildings and facilities that go along with them, like bus depots and maintenance facilities.
So it's really about making sure people can get around safely and efficiently.
Exactly. And this is a really big deal because these systems are used by so many people in cities, Millions of people rely on public transportation, so making sure those systems are built safely is absolutely crucial.
It is. And these federal labor standards, they play a huge role in making sure that happens.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered transportation, housing, education, healthcare, and even emergency preparedness. Are there any other areas we need to talk about?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Let's talk about the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, which is under 42 U.S.C. 2947. This act is huge, and it covers construction projects that are financed with federal assistance for all kinds of anti-poverty programs.
Okay, so this is about helping people who are struggling financially.
Exactly. It covers youth training centers, community-level anti-poverty programs, loans to low-income families, and co-ops in rural areas, loans specifically for small businesses to build stuff, and even experimental projects to help people who are unemployed.
So it's really broad in its scope.
It really is. And this act shows how the government's efforts to combat poverty often involve construction projects. But the thing is, whenever the feds get involved, they bring those labor and safety standards along with them.
So even when it's about helping people out of poverty, worker safety is still a top priority.
Absolutely. And then we have the Housing Act of 1964 again, specifically sections 42 U.S.C. 1486 and 1452 B.E. This part of the act provides financial aid specifically for building low-rent housing for farm workers and also for rehab loans in urban renewal areas. It shows how even within those broader housing laws, there are specific sections that target certain types of housing and make sure those projects are adhering to these regulations.
Okay, that makes sense.
And speaking of targeted programs, there's the Commercial Fisheries Research and Development Act of 1964, which is 16 U.S.C. 779 EB. This one authorizes financial assistance to states specifically for building stuff related to, research and development for commercial fisheries.
So even the fishing industry gets some love from the feds.
They do. And when those projects get federal money, they have to follow those labor and safety standards too. It's all about making sure the work is done right and workers are protected no matter what industry we're talking about.
Absolutely. Now, what about like training for nurses and other healthcare professionals? Are there any laws that specifically address that?
Yes, there are. For nurses, there's the Nurse Training Act of 1964, which is under 42 USC 296 AB5. It provides grants to help build new nursing schools or fix up or replace the old ones. So it's all about making sure there are enough well-trained nurses out there.
And that those schools are safe places to learn.
Exactly. And then moving back to education, there's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which is found at 20 USC 241I and 848. Now, this one gives financial aid to schools in low-income areas, and that aid can be used for construction projects that expand or improve their programs.
So even K through 12 schools, they can be subject to these regulations if they're getting federal funding for construction.
Right. And the feds want to make sure those schools are safe for both the students and the workers.
Makes sense.
Now, let's talk about the environment for a bit. There's the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, as amended, which is under 3 USC 466 EG. This act gives financial aid to states and cities for building facilities that help prevent water pollution.
So like water treatment plants and things like that.
Exactly. And it also covers sewage treatment plants. So even those projects that are all about protecting the environment, they also have to follow these labor and safety standards when they're built with federal money.
It's all connected, isn't it?
It really is. And then there's the Appalachian Regional Development Act of 1965, which is found under 40 USC F 402. This act provides federal aid for a whole bunch of construction projects in the Appalachian region, like highways, healthcare facilities, projects to seal and rehab old mines, vocational schools, and even sewage treatment plants.
So it's like a focused effort to improve the infrastructure in that specific region.
Exactly. And they're making sure those projects are done safely and fairly.
That's great. Now, are there any other acts we need to cover?
Yeah, there are a few more. Like there's the National Technical Institute for the Deaf Act, 20 USC 684B5, which provides financial aid specifically for establishing and constructing the National Institution for the Deaf. So it's another example of how even specialized schools fall under this regulatory framework.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then you have the Housing Act of 1959, 12 USC 1701 Q3, which authorizes loans to nonprofit groups specifically for building or rehabbing housing and related facilities for elderly families. So it's all about making sure there's safe and accessible housing for older folks.
And those projects, of course, have to follow these standards too.
They do. And then there's the College Housing Act of 1950, as amended, which is found under 12 USC 1749 AF. This one's about providing federal loans to schools so they can build housing for students and faculty and other essential facilities, too. It shows how the government's been committed to supporting higher education infrastructure for a long time, and that includes making sure those projects are done safely and with fair labor practices.
It's all about investing in the future, right?
Absolutely. And then there's the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1965, which is under 42 USC 1500 C3 and 3107. This act provides federal help for all kinds of community development projects like creating parks and other open spaces in cities, building water and sewer systems, and even building those neighborhood facilities that provide healthcare, recreation, and social services in lower income areas.
It's really about improving the quality of life for everyone in the community.
Exactly. And it just shows how much the government cares about making communities better, but also about making sure those projects are done right.
Absolutely. Okay, so what else do we need to cover?
Well, there's the National Foundation on the Arts and the Humanities Act of 1965, 20 USC 954K. Now, this act lets the government give matching grants to arts organizations and individuals, and some of those grants can be used to build the facilities they need.
So even the arts get some support from the feds.
They do, and when those projects involve federal funding, they have to follow those labor and safety standards too. It's all about making sure that the arts can flourish, but also that the workers involved are treated fairly and are safe.
It's a good balance.
It is. And then we have the Public Works and Economic Development Act of 1965, which is under 42 USC 32222. This act provides federal aid for public works projects and development facilities in areas that are trying to redevelop, boost their economies. It covers stuff like buying land, giving loans for industrial and commercial buildings, and even setting up economic development centers.
So it's about revitalizing struggling communities.
Exactly. And again, when the government provides that aid, they make sure those projects are done right, with fair labor practices and safe working conditions. It's all part of the deal.
Okay, what else is there?
Well, there's the high-speed ground transportation study, which is under 40 USC 163.